In the merciless winter of 1881, in the high plains of Wyoming Territory, near what would later become the town of Lander, a man named Isaac Coleman became the subject of ridicule that echoed through every homestead within a day's ride. Coleman, a former stonemason from Pennsylvania, who'd come west after his wife's death seeking a fresh start, had begun constructing what neighbors called the strangest dwelling they'd ever laid eyes on. While every other settler in the region built their homes the tried and true way, with squared-off log cabins chinked with mud and moss, Coleman was piling fieldstone into a circular wall that rose from the frozen ground like some ancient ruin. The structure made no sense to anyone who saw it. Cabins had corners, everyone knew that. Corners were where you stacked your provisions, where you built your bunks, where the stove fit snug against the wall. A roundhouse. It was the kind of foolishness that made grown men shake their heads and women whisper concerns about a widower's troubled mind. Isaac Coleman had come to Wyoming in the spring of 1880, settling on 160 acres of land that stretched across a wind-scoured valley where sage and buffalo grass clung to soil that froze solid half the year. His nearest neighbor, a Norwegian family named the Larsens, lived close to 3 miles northeast, far enough that you couldn't hear a man shouting, but near enough to borrow tools if the need arose. To the south, maybe 4 miles as the crow flies, the Hendersons worked a cattle operation, while the McBride homestead sat a half-day's ride to the west. These were hardy people, survivors who'd learned from those who came before them. They built their cabins the way their fathers had built cabins, the way every sensible person built shelter in country where winter could kill you as sure as any wild animal. 4 walls of logs, notched at the corners, a pitched roof to shed snow, a stone chimney on the gable end. The design worked well enough, though everyone knew you'd spend half your waking hours in winter feeding the fire, and even then, the corners stayed cold enough to freeze water in a bucket overnight. But Isaac Coleman had noticed something the others hadn't, or perhaps something they'd noticed, but never thought to act upon. During his first winter in a temporary dugout shelter carved into a hillside, he'd observed how the earth itself held warmth, how the curved walls of his crude refuge seemed to shed the wind better than the sharp angles of the cabins he'd visit. He'd watched how snowdrifts piled against the flat faces of log walls, creating cold spots that seeped through the chinking, while the rounded contours of natural rock formations nearby seemed to let the wind slide past without building up those deadly accumulations of cold. When he tried to explain this to Lars Larsen one afternoon in early autumn, gesturing at the hills and trying to describe what he'd felt living in that dugout, the Norwegian had looked at him with the patient expression a man uses with someone who's had too much whiskey. Coleman's own brother-in-law, visiting from back east, had been more direct. "Isaac," he'd said, "grief has added your thinking. Build a proper cabin before winter kills you." The weight of that dismissal sat heavy on Coleman through the late summer of 1880. His neighbors thought him mad, his family thought him broken by loss, and there were long nights when he wondered if they were right. The temptation to simply build a conventional cabin was strong. He knew how to do it, had the skills and the strength. It would be easier, would quiet the whispers, would prove he was still the capable man he'd been before his world fell apart. But something in him, some stubborn ember of the craftsman he'd been, refused to let go of what he'd observed. He'd spent 20 years working stone in Pennsylvania, had built foundations that would stand for generations, had learned to read how rock wanted to sit, how it bore weight, how it endured. The idea that had taken root in his mind wasn't madness, it was something else entirely, something that made sense to him in a way he couldn't quite put into words. In early September, as the aspens on the mountainsides began to turn gold, Isaac Coleman made his decision. Let them talk. He knew stone, and he knew cold, and he was going to build something that married the two in a way this territory had never seen. The social cost of that decision became apparent almost immediately. When word spread that Coleman was actually going through with his circular stone house, the invitations to Sunday dinners dried up. The Hendersons stopped riding over for the occasional evening visit. Even Lars Larsen, who'd been friendly enough despite his skepticism, began to keep his distance, as if foolishness might be catching. Coleman found himself working alone through the shortening days of autumn, and the silence was almost as cold as the wind beginning to sweep down from the mountains. His sister wrote from Pennsylvania begging him to come home, to leave this mad venture before he froze to death in the first blizzard. The local minister, passing through on his monthly circuit, had stopped to pray with Coleman about the sin of pride and the wisdom of heeding community counsel. Through it all, Coleman kept working, though there were moments when he'd stop, hands raw from moving stone, and wonder if everyone else could see something he was blind to. Maybe his design was foolish. Maybe tradition endured because it was right. But then he'd remember the terrible cold in his dugout's corners, the blessed warmth of its curved walls, and he'd lift another stone into place. In the third week of September 1880, Isaac Coleman began in earnest. The timing mattered. He needed the foundation set before the ground froze solid, needed the walls raised high enough to support a roof before snow made the work impossible. His plan was born from observation and the practical knowledge of a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life. He'd build a stone wall in a circle, roughly the same diameter inside as the cabin the Larsons had built, wide enough for a man to lie down crossways with room to spare. But instead of a single wall thickness like the log cabins, he'd make his wall double, 2 rings of stone with a gap between them near the width of a man's hand. He'd seen how the air trapped between 2 layers kept things warmer, the same way 2 blankets worked better than 1 thick quilt. He couldn't have explained the science behind it, didn't know words like insulation or thermal mass, but he knew what he'd felt, and he trusted that knowledge. When he tried to explain this to James Henderson, who'd ridden over out of morbid curiosity, the cattleman had just shook his head. "You're making double the work for yourself, Coleman," Henderson had said. "And for what? A house with no proper corners and walls thick enough to waste half your floor space. It's pure foolishness." The stones came from his own land and the surrounding territory, gathered from creek beds and hillsides where ancient forces had scattered them like seeds. Coleman hauled them in a wagon he'd bought for a song from a freighter heading back east, pulled by a pair of horses that learned the routes between the stone fields and the building site as well as he did. He chose each rock with care, looking for pieces that would fit together with minimal gaps, that had flat faces to stack solid, that were small enough for one man to lift, but large enough to build with efficiency. The type varied with what the land offered. Some granite worn smooth by water, some sandstone that split into useful slabs, some rounded river rock that needed careful placement. He worked alone most days, sunrise to sunset, and the solitude became its own kind of companionship. The work was brutal, the kind that left his back screaming and his hands bleeding through the calluses, but there was a rhythm to it that quieted the grief that still ambushed him in idle moments. By late October, as the first serious cold began to settle in, the foundation was complete and the walls were rising. Coleman had laid the stones without mortar, fitting them together in the old way, the way stone wanted to lie. He'd learned long ago that well-fitted stone could bear tremendous weight without the need for cement or lime. And out here, where such materials would cost a small fortune to freight in, the old methods made economic sense as much as practical sense. The double wall grew steadily, the outer ring and inner ring rising together, connected every few courses by flat stones that bridged the gap and kept the walls tied together. The space between them, that hand's width of air, was the heart of his design, the thing that would make the difference when winter truly showed its teeth. As the walls rose past the height of a man's head, then higher still, neighbors who rode by would stop and stare, but fewer stopped to talk. The McBrides, passing on their way to the trading post at South Pass City, had paused long enough for the wife to call out, "Mr. Coleman, that's the strangest thing I ever seen." Like some old Indian ruins or something foreigners might build. Her husband had been less kind, muttering something about wasted effort and winter teaching hard lessons to fools. The incomprehension from his neighbors stung more than Coleman wanted to admit, but it also hardened something in him. He'd been raised to value community, to trust in the wisdom of many over the judgment of one, but he'd also been raised to trust his hands and his craft. Every stone he set told him he was right, that this design had merit, that the principle he was working from was sound, even if he couldn't articulate it in ways that would convince a skeptic. When winter came, one of 2 things would happen. Either his round stone house would keep him alive and comfortable, proving that observation and adaptation could outmatch blind tradition, or he'd freeze to death and become a cautionary tale about the dangers of thinking yourself smarter than everyone else. Either way, the talking would stop. Through November he worked, racing against the weather, and as the first snows began to dust the sage, Isaac Coleman finished the walls of his circular home and began to set the rafters for a conical roof that would crown his controversial creation. The roof presented its own challenges. But Coleman's carpentry skills, learned alongside his stonework, served him well. He'd cut timber from the foothills, lodgepole pines straight as rifle barrels, and fashioned them into rafters that met at a central point like the spokes of a wheel. The design meant every rafter bore weight equally, no weak points where snow could accumulate and break through, and the steep pitch would shed snow as fast as it fell. He covered the rafters with split shingles he'd laboriously shaped over evening hours, overlapping them in layers that would turn rain and snowmelt. The work took him through the first week of December, working in cold that made his fingers clumsy and his breath hang in the air like smoke. When he finally set the last shingle and climbed down, his home looked unlike anything else in the territory. A conical roof rising from circular stone walls, stout and strange, looking for all the world like something from another time or place. The Larson boy, riding past with his father, had pointed and said, "It looks like a fairy tale castle, Pa, but without the top part." Lars had replied, "It looks like the work of a man who'll learn respect for tradition when the cold really comes." Inside, Coleman set about finishing the details that would make the structure livable. He built a fireplace not against a wall, but in the very center of the circular space, the chimney rising straight up through the peak of the roof. This too seemed mad to the conventional eye, wasting valuable wall space where a hearth traditionally sat, but Coleman's reasoning was deliberate. A fire in the center would heat the entire space evenly, the warmth radiating out to every part of the curved walls with no cold corners left untouched. The thick stone walls themselves, he reasoned, would hold that heat through the night, releasing it slowly like coals banking in a fireplace. He arranged his living space around the central hearth in a circle, his bed against one section of wall, his table and chairs against another, his provisions and tools organized along the curve. It felt strange at first, living in a round room, but he quickly discovered unexpected benefits. The flow of movement was natural, no bumping into corners in the dark, no dead spaces where things got forgotten. Everything was equally accessible, equally warmed, equally part of the whole. The first true test came in late December, a cold snap that dropped temperatures to where breath froze on beards and water in the horse troughs turned to solid ice. It wasn't yet the killing cold that would come later, but it was cold enough to test the worth of any shelter. Inside his stone circle, with a moderate fire burning in the central hearth, Coleman found himself comfortable in ways he hadn't been since leaving Pennsylvania. The air inside stayed warm enough that he could move about in a single layer of clothes, could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned, could wake without his water bucket frozen solid. He burned less wood than he'd expected, perhaps half what he would have needed in a conventional cabin, because the heat from the fire stayed in the space, instead of being drawn up a chimney mounted on an exterior wall. The thick stone walls didn't just block the wind, they seemed to absorb the warmth and hold it, creating a steadiness of temperature that felt almost miraculous. Coleman walked over to the Larson place a few days into the cold snap, wanting to share what he'd discovered, still hoping that maybe they'd see the merit in what he'd built. The Norwegian family was huddled around their stove, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, the children wrapped in blankets, despite the fire that devoured wood almost as fast as Lars could feed it. The corners of the cabin were rimed with frost, ice forming on the nails driven through the logs, and despite the roaring heat near the stove, the far side of the room was cold enough to see your breath. Lars had been cordial but dismissive when Coleman tried to explain how warm his own place stayed. "You've got a new house, Coleman," he'd said. "Wait until the chinking dries and shrinks. Wait until the wind finds every gap. Wait until real winter comes. Then we'll see." The conversation had ended there, and Coleman had walked home through snow squeaking under his boots, the cold so fierce it burned his lungs, knowing that he'd found something real, but couldn't make anyone believe him. But understanding why his design worked had been important to Coleman, not just building it blind. He'd spent evening hours by his central fire, thinking through what made his stone circle different from a log cabin, and the answers, when they came, were rooted in the simple observations of a practical man. The double wall worked like wearing a coat over a shirt, trapping air that didn't move, didn't carry heat away. The stone itself held warmth the way a rock near a campfire stays hot long after the flames die, releasing that heat slowly through the night when the fire burned low. The circular shape meant there were no corners where cold could settle and stay, no sharp angles where wind could press and penetrate. The central fireplace heated the whole space equally, and because the chimney rose through the center of the room rather than up an outside wall, Even the heat that escaped up the flue warmed the living space before leaving. It was all so simple, so obvious in hindsight. Like the way a cellar dug into the earth stays cool in summer and doesn't freeze solid in winter. Like the way animals denned in hollows and caves rather than building structures with corners and gaps. He thought about trying to explain this to the Hendersons or the McBrides, about walking them through the reasoning step by step, but he knew how it would sound. They'd hear a man justifying his eccentricity, spinning reasons for something that simply didn't fit how things were done, so he kept to himself through the deepening winter, kept his fire burning steady, kept his home warm and comfortable, while the wind howled across the plains and the snow piled up in drifts that buried fence posts. Occasionally he'd see smoke rising from the distant cabins of his neighbors and imagine them huddled near their stoves, burning through their wood supplies, enduring rather than living. Part of him wanted vindication, wanted them to see that he'd been right, but a larger part just wished they could share in what he'd discovered. The warmth he'd created wasn't just physical comfort, it was the satisfaction of seeing something clearly and having the courage to act on it, even when everyone else thought you were wrong. As 1881 arrived and January deepened, the old-timers in the region began to feel something in the air, something they recognized from years of reading the signs the land gave. The magpies gathered in larger flocks than usual, their harsh calls echoing across the frozen landscape. Cattle bunched together in the lowest spots they could find, seeking what little shelter the terrain offered. The sunset colors ran to deep crimsons and purples that painted the snow in shades of blood and bruise. Men who'd lived through the winter of 71 started checking their hay supplies and wood piles with worried eyes, started making sure their stock was as close to shelter as possible, started warning anyone who'd listen that something bad was coming. Lars Larsen rode over to Coleman's place in mid-January, the first time he'd visited in months, to urge him to move his horses into the lean-to he'd built on the south side of his strange house, to make sure he had enough wood split and stacked close to hand. "The signs are all wrong, Coleman," Lars had said, the concern genuine despite their differences. "We're going to see cold like you've never felt. Mark my words. Make sure you're ready." The storm that would later be called the Great Blizzard of 1881 began on January 22nd, with a wind that came down from Canada like the breath of something ancient and merciless. The temperature, which had been cold but manageable, dropped so fast that water thrown from a bucket froze before it hit the ground. The wind drove snow so thick you couldn't see your hand before your face, and the cold that came with it was the kind that killed in minutes if you were caught unprepared. It lasted for 3 days, the wind never stopping, the cold never relenting, temperatures dropping to where even the veterans of the territory had no words for it, except to say it was cold enough to freeze the soul right out of a man. In the scattered homesteads across the region, families burned everything they could, furniture, fence posts, anything that would make heat, huddled together under every blanket and hide they owned, and prayed for morning. Inside his circular stone house, Isaac Coleman tended his central fire and listened to the storm rage outside. The wind screamed across the plains, rattled the shingles on his conical roof, drove snow against the stone walls with a sound like sand being thrown against glass. But inside, the temperature stayed warm enough that he could move about in comfort, warm enough that his water didn't freeze, warm enough that he could sleep without fear. He fed the fire every few hours, using far less wood than he'd expected, watching the flames dance in the central hearth and feeling the heat spread evenly through the circular space. The stone walls absorbed the warmth and gave it back, creating a cocoon of livable air while the world outside tried to kill anything that drew breath. He thought about his neighbors, wondered how they were faring, hoped they'd found ways to survive the cold. The storm was so fierce that checking on anyone was impossible, but he knew that in cabins all across the valley, people were fighting for their lives against temperatures that made a mockery of conventional shelter. On the third day, as the storm began to show signs of easing, Coleman heard something over the wind that made his heart jump. Someone was pounding on his door, the sound desperate and urgent. He threw it open to find Lars Larsen, the Norwegian's face so frost-burned it was nearly black, his eyes wild with cold and fear. "Coleman," Lars managed through lips so frozen he could barely form words. "My family, we're freezing. The cabin, everything's frozen solid. Can we please?" Coleman didn't let him finish, just grabbed his coat and followed Lars out into cold so vicious it felt like being stabbed with knives made of ice. The short walk to the Larson cabin, no more than 3 miles but taking close to 2 hours in the storm, showed him drifts higher than a man's head and a landscape so transformed by wind and snow that familiar landmarks had vanished. The Larson cabin was a study in survival at its limits. The family, parents, and 3 children were clustered within arm's reach of a stove that glowed cherry red from being driven as hard as the metal could stand. Despite this, frost covered every surface more than a few feet from the heat, ice inches thick on the walls, the corners of the cabin so cold that wind whistled through gaps in the chinking that had opened from the wood, shrinking in the terrible cold. They'd burned all their furniture, most of their fence posts were down to the last of their split wood. Another day, maybe 2, and they'd have nothing left to burn, and that would be the end. Coleman saw all this in an instant, saw the desperation in Lars's eyes, saw the children shivering despite being wrapped in every blanket the family owned. "Get them ready to move," Coleman said. "Bring what you can carry. You're coming to my place." The journey back to Coleman's circular stone house, with the Larson family in tow, was a nightmare of cold and wind that Coleman would remember for the rest of his life. They moved through drifts, breaking trail, carrying the youngest child because her legs wouldn't work anymore from the cold, shouting encouragement over the wind to keep everyone moving. When they finally reached the door and stumbled inside, the contrast was so immediate, so dramatic, that Lars Larson actually stopped in the doorway, unable to believe what he was feeling. The warmth hit like a physical thing, air that didn't hurt to breathe, space where ice didn't coat every surface, a fire that heated the whole room instead of just a narrow circle around the stove. Coleman settled the family near the central hearth, gave them warm food and water that wasn't frozen, watched the life come back into faces that had been going grey with cold. For a long time, nobody spoke, too exhausted and too shocked by the difference between the 2 structures to find words. It was near midnight when Lars Larson finally broke the silence. He was sitting by the fire, his children asleep under blankets, his wife dozing with her head against his shoulder, and when he looked up at Coleman, there were tears in his eyes that had nothing to do with the smoke from the fire. "Isaac," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion and something that might have been shame. "I was wrong. We all were. This house of yours, this crazy round thing we all mocked, it just saved my family's lives. That cold would have killed us in another day, maybe less. The cabin I built, the cabin I was so certain was right because it's how everyone does it. It nearly murdered my children. And here you are, comfortable as if it's spring, burning half the wood I was using, and warm all the way to the walls." He looked around the circular space, at the even warmth, at the central fire radiating heat to every part of the room, at the thick stone walls that held that warmth like a blessing. "You tried to tell me. You tried to explain, and I thought you were mad. I'm sorry, Isaac. I'm more sorry than I have words for." Coleman sat quiet for a moment, watching the fire, feeling the vindication he'd thought he wanted, but finding it mixed with something closer to sadness. "I didn't build this to prove anyone wrong, Lars," he finally said. "I built it because I saw something, felt something that made sense to me. The round shape, the double walls, the way stone holds heat, it all just seemed right. I'm glad it worked, glad your family is safe, but I never wanted to be right this way with you and yours nearly dying to prove it." They sat together in the warm darkness, 2 men from different places who'd learned different lessons from the same brutal land, and something shifted between them, some wall of pride and assumption crumbling like ice in the sun. When dawn came and the storm showed signs of breaking, Lars made a decision. His family would stay with Coleman until the cold released its grip, and when spring came, he'd be the first to ask Coleman to help him rebuild, to show him how to make a structure that worked with the land instead of just enduring it. The storm broke on the 4th day, and the aftermath revealed damage across the territory that would be remembered for generations. Cabins had failed, roofs collapsed under snow and shrinking timbers, livestock frozen where they stood. Families who hadn't been as fortunate as the Larsons perished in homes that couldn't keep out the cold. But word also spread about Isaac Coleman's strange circular stone house, about how it had stayed warm through the worst weather anyone could remember, about how the family of his strongest critic had survived there while their own cabin became a death trap. James Henderson rode over as soon as the trails were passable, walked into Coleman's house without invitation, stood in the center of the room feeling the even warmth, and walked out again without a word. He came back 3 days later with his oldest son and a wagon full of stone they'd gathered from their own land. "Show me how you did it," was all he said. but his voice held none of the condescension of months before, just the humility of a man who'd seen proof he couldn't deny. Through the late winter and early spring of 1881, Isaac Coleman's home became a gathering place in ways it never had before. Neighbors who'd scorned his design rode over to see it for themselves, to feel the warmth, to ask questions about how he'd built it, why he'd chosen a circle, how the double walls worked, what made the central fireplace heat so well. Coleman explained as best he could, always emphasizing that he'd worked from observation and feeling rather than book learning, that anyone could have seen what he'd seen if they'd been willing to look at old problems with fresh eyes. Some folks understood, others just accepted that it worked even if they couldn't grasp why, but all of them came away convinced that tradition, while valuable, wasn't the only path to survival in this harsh land. Lars Larsen kept his word. When the ground thawed enough to work, he began dismantling the cabin that had nearly killed his family and building a new structure under Coleman's guidance. It wasn't an exact copy of Coleman's house. Lars adapted the principles to his own needs and resources, but it was circular, stone-walled, with that crucial gap between inner and outer rings that trapped air and held warmth. The Hendersons followed suit, then the McBrides, and by the end of 1882, 3 more circular stone houses stood in the valley, each one testimony to the day Isaac Coleman had been willing to look foolish in the eyes of everyone around him because he trusted what he'd learned from paying attention to the land. The original house, Coleman's controversial creation, stood for more than 40 years, outliving Isaac himself and serving families through winters that ranged from mild to murderous. It became a kind of landmark, the roundhouse they called it, a place where travelers could find shelter and warmth, where neighbors would gather to share news and stories, where the memory of the winter it proved its worth became the stuff of fireside tales. When it finally fell into disuse in the 1920s, as the region modernized and old homesteads were abandoned, for towns with electricity and heated stores, people would still point out the ruins and tell the story of the widower who built crazy and was proven right by the worst cold anyone could remember. The principle Coleman had discovered, that observation and adaptation could outperform blind tradition, that old problems might have solutions waiting in the shapes the land itself provided, spread beyond that valley in Wyoming. Travelers carried the tale, other builders adapted the ideas, and while circular stone houses never became common, they were no longer unthinkable, no longer marks of madness, but rather evidence that innovation could come from anywhere if a person was willing to look with clear eyes and trust what they saw, even when everyone else thought them a fool. Sitting here now, more than a century after Isaac Coleman stacked those first stones into a circle that defied everything his neighbors knew about proper houses, it's worth reflecting on what that story means beyond the specific technique of building round instead of square. Coleman's journey from ridicule to vindication isn't really about architecture or thermal dynamics or any of the technical details that made his house work so well. It's about the courage required to see something everyone else has missed, to act on that seeing even when the social cost is high, to persist through mockery and isolation because the evidence of your own experience tells you you're on the right path. How many innovations, how many solutions to old problems have been lost because the person who glimpsed them lacked Coleman's stubborn willingness to be thought a fool? How many times do we default to tradition, not because it's best, but because it's safe, because it protects us from the judgment of those around us? The frontier demanded adaptation in ways our modern world has largely forgotten, but the principle remains true. Real progress often looks like foolishness until the moment it proves itself, and the people who drive that progress are rarely the ones who follow conventional wisdom without question. They're the Isaac Colemans of the world, the ones who pay attention to what their hands and eyes tell them, who trust their own observations even when those observations lead to conclusions that make others uncomfortable. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being right too soon, in seeing solutions before the problem has become dire enough for others to recognize the need for change. Coleman lived that loneliness through the autumn of 1880, worked through it stone by stone, and found his vindication in the warmth that saved his skeptics' lives when winter showed its teeth. What we owe to people like Isaac Coleman isn't just gratitude for their specific innovations, though those matter. What we owe them is the willingness to honor their example by staying open to the possibility that the next crazy idea, the next break from tradition, the next thing that makes no sense to everyone except the person proposing it, might actually be the solution we need. We owe them the humility to remember that conventional wisdom is often just collective comfort, masquerading as truth, and that real wisdom comes from watching closely, thinking carefully, and having the courage to act on what we learn, even when that action makes us look strange to those around us. The round stone house in Wyoming Territory proved the value of those qualities when temperatures dropped to 58 below zero and tradition failed while innovation endured. If these stories of frontier ingenuity and human determination resonate with you, if you find value in preserving the memory of people who solved impossible problems with nothing but observation and grit, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. These aren't just tales of old techniques and forgotten skills. They're stories about what human beings are capable of when they trust their own eyes and refuse to let mockery stop them from trying something new. There are dozens more of these narratives waiting to be told, accounts of ordinary people on the frontier who became extraordinary through nothing more than paying attention and having the courage to act. Share your own family stories in the comments if you have them. The grandfather who built different, the grandmother who farmed in ways that seemed strange but worked, the ancestors who trusted their judgment over community opinion and were eventually proven right. These stories matter, not as museum pieces, but as reminders of what we're all capable of when we choose observation over assumption and courage over comfort. In the end, Isaac Coleman's legacy isn't really a building technique or a specific design for cold weather survival, though both of those things have their value. His legacy is the example he set, the demonstration that one person willing to look closely and think differently can sometimes see solutions that entire communities have missed. That kind of vision isn't reserved for geniuses or experts. It's available to anyone willing to pay attention, to question, to try something new even when everyone else thinks it won't work. The frontier demanded that kind of thinking because the margin for error was measured in lives lost or saved, but we still need it today, perhaps more than we know. The next time you encounter someone whose idea seems crazy, whose approach breaks with how things have always been done, remember Isaac Coleman and his roundstone house, and consider that maybe, just maybe, they're seeing something the rest of us have missed.